This is the Policy Pairing Series. I want to thank a few people, especially our sponsor, all the folks behind the CT 20x17 campaign. Before I launch into a few brief remarks so I can get right back into the panel, I want to introduce Armando Paolino from the Greater Waterbury Chamber of Commerce. Thank you.
Thanks, folks. So I'm just doing a little introduction here. I'm filling in for Don McPartland, who couldn't be here tonight. He's working on fireworks from Holy Land. So I want to welcome everyone for being here tonight. I want to first thank our panelists and all of you for coming and to be part of this important conversation. Connecticut 20x17 is a coalition of over 80 businesses, professional, and community organizations working together to move Connecticut up into the top 20 states to live, work, and raise a family by 2017. Tonight, we're going to tackle taxes, always fun, an important issue for Connecticut's families, residents, and job creators alike. And I hope you all had a beer before we start this. Given the tenor at the Capitol, that might be a good thing. The heavy personal and corporate tax burden in our state has ranked us near the bottom of states in various national surveys. To make matters worse, the cost of doing business and raising a family here are worse than in all but 2 other states, according to Forbes magazine. The budget discussion at the Capitol is of great concern to the Waterbury Chamber, our members, and others in the state who see Connecticut's potential but are frustrated by the state pattern of deficits and higher taxes. Some skeptics say this is the new normal. They say slow growth, limited opportunity, and low rankings are here for the long term. We don't believe the skeptics, and we don't have to settle for that kind of future. We can do better than more taxes. Together, we can use strategic tax policy to nurture growth, innovation, and opportunity. We can promote policies that foster growth from the bottom up, giving job creators of all sizes the confidence to open up the economy for all Connecticut residents and families. Like you, I'm looking forward to tonight's discussion and how our policymakers can use tax policies to move Connecticut up. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Armando. Appreciate it. Most of the folks in this room know that we're the Connecticut Mirror. We're a nonprofit news organization. We have more journalists at the state capitol than any other news organization in the state. We have 10 strategic media partners, including the Waterbury Republican American. We cover about 70% of the state. One of the things that we try to do also is get out in the community, try to grow our audience, and that's one of the initiatives that we have here with the Policy Pairing Series. The Connecticut local brewery community is growing in the state, and we figured, why not try to partner with them? It's probably one industries in the state that hasn't been slammed for one reason or the other. So we said, give it a shot. Then we tried figuring out what should we discuss. And we said taxes. How do we make taxes interesting or even entertaining? Luckily, we have Keith Phaneuf, our budget reporter, and our distinguished panel here. So a lot of you guys didn't come here to hear me speak. Please enjoy the beer, the food. I'm going to turn this over to Keith, and he'll introduce our distinguished panel. Thank you for supporting the Mirror. Check out our other events as well. 2 Roads next Tuesday, May 12th at Hooker, and May 19th at Half Full in Stamford. Thank you all for coming. Keith?
Brett reminded me that we're doing this at a brewery, so even though we're talking about taxes, let's try to keep it informal. Let's try to keep it casual. Let's try not to have a lot of long-winded questions. And I said, if any of you know me, that's not going to happen. So, I can keep it casual. Anybody who's seen how I dress at the Capitol, this is about as dressed up as I can get. But we do have a really good panel. And what we're going to try to do is talk for about maybe half hour, 35 minutes, get a sense of the issues that these gentlemen want to highlight. Then I'd like to open it up, again, very informally, take questions from the audience, and we're going to go till about, as long as you're interested, until about 7 o'clock. So, to start, on my far right, I want to make sure that I can pronounce the company name correctly, Steve. We have Steve LaRosa, who's the Senior Director for State and Local Tax Policy for Alexion Pharmaceuticals in Cheshire. You only have the responsibility of representing Connecticut's entire business community. So you can say for everyone. The excellent.
No problem. We got it covered. Yeah, Bonnie's coming.
Moving to my left, we have State Comptroller Kevin Lembo, who has really taken the lead this session in trying to get Connecticut to think a little bit more holistically, not only about how it raises its money, but quite frankly, how it plans to stabilize both its tax system and its finances. And then to my immediate right, we have State Senator Scott Frantz, who I guess you have to represent all Republican interests and everything to my right.
And taxpayers.
And I can't top that. There are a few taxpayers in Fairfield County. He's the ranking member on the legislature's Finance, Revenue, and Bonding Committee. I believe you also are serving on the tax study panel.
Ex officio.
Ex officio.
I don't have a vote, but yes.
Okay. So, okay. Gentlemen, to start, I mean, tonight I'd like to cover a lot of issues in tax fairness, volatility. I think I'd like to start, though, the one thing I wanted to avoid is have everybody say, well, we should have less taxes. Because we can produce a poll in just about every single state that says, surprisingly, people think they're taxed too much. Let's assume that's a given on that one and move on. I'd like to start, whoever wants to go first. What part of our tax system right now is not working the best? And I guess I don't want to do it lightning round, but I want to just start getting that on the table briefly, and we'll build from there. So, Steve, you got the microphone. Why don't we go with you first?
Can you hear me okay? Okay. I think when you look at our tax structure, we're not that dissimilar to most other states. Okay, we have property tax, we have a personal income tax, we have a sales and use tax, etc. What I think isn't working is the way we execute on each of those taxes. And kind of the devil's in the details. Let me just give you, by way of example, and I don't want to go on and on, but we'll just give you a quick example. So for instance, you look at Connecticut, we have a sales tax, right? Statutory rate, 6.35%. And we look at, let's say, Massachusetts by way of example. You know, proximity to Connecticut on our northern border has a tax rate for sales tax purposes of 6.25%, right? Comparable rate, you think, okay, all things being equal, you know, Connecticut should be competitive with Massachusetts. The thing, though, is when you look at what Massachusetts taxes compared to what Connecticut taxes, the devil's in the details. It's in the tax base. So, for instance, Massachusetts, unlike Connecticut, does not tax business services. I mean, Connecticut taxes management consulting, business analysis services, strategic type services that corporate headquartered businesses and small businesses rely on in the state for advice, and they're paying that sales tax on it. It's in essence is almost they're taxing a business input. So I'd say broadly speaking, macro level, Connecticut isn't that different than other states, but it's those components that Connecticut has chosen.
Okay, that's good.
I guess two parts. One is, I think only December 2014 did Connecticut unpack its tax code in any way, and when the Department of Revenue Services finally sort of did a tax incidence analysis, you know, really looking at all the taxes that have been put in places over time and who bears the impact of those. You know, it's really easy to say, well, we're going to tax a landlord, but without understanding that that actually is, the burden falls onto the tenant, you know, over time. Without understanding over time who gets hit by that tax, you end up sort of doing things that are in direct policy conflict with your other stated public policy goals. So it's great that that was done. It's great that the tax panel is meeting and beginning to do their work and having important conversations about that. But that's sort of one piece for me. But I think if I had to pick the most broken tax in the state, it would be the property tax.
So we know for a fact that there are 386 taxes on the books here in Connecticut. Did you all know that? 386. And of those 386, there are probably, and we're going to find out over the course of the life of this tax panel, that there are probably 25 or 30 that don't even carry their own weight. In other words, they don't collect enough money to pay for the cost that it takes to go out and collect that money. So that's, obviously something that doesn't work in all of our minds with respect to the tax code. If I had to name one other one that I think is very damaging to the future of the state of Connecticut, it's the estate tax. And I know it's a hard thing to lose quickly or even over the course of time, but what's happening is you're looking at a big migration of families out of the state of Connecticut, particularly in the southwestern part, but there are also pockets throughout the entire state of Connecticut where I'm very worried people are moving away, and they're moving away at a much younger age. They're taking with them, obviously, their wealth. They may keep their home here, but they become a resident in Florida, South Carolina, wherever it is down south, and take advantage of a much better, easier climate physically, but also business-wise and tax-wise. And you end up losing massive amounts of tax revenues to the state of Connecticut. I know for a fact last week someone confirmed that a resident from southwestern Connecticut will move and will take with them probably $60, $70 million of revenue to the state of Connecticut every year. And the Yankee Institute just put out, I think you saw it, Bonnie, it's hot off the press, the actual details of Eddie Lambert's departure, another hedge fund guy. Whether you like these guys or not, they're the ones who are paying the bills in Connecticut. They're leaving, unfortunately, and they take with them their economic development contributions, their philanthropy, their other contributions to the community.
Okay. Well, we kind of made a couple references to the income tax, so let's just talk about that for a minute. We're talking about a tax that brings in about half of all the money state government spends. And you generally hear two debates at the Capitol. You'll hear people say that the income tax is driving the wealthy out of Connecticut, and then you'll have another side say actually that Connecticut's not a bad deal. And I want to test that because we do have lower income tax rates than the states we compete with around Wall Street. And I'm talking about the top marginal rates in New Jersey, New York State, let alone if you live in New York City. So let me, and I want to hear from everyone. Let me start with Senator Frantz. Why are the wealthy, if it's just about the income tax, not pouring into Connecticut to escape the taxes in New Jersey or New York? Or is it because there are other problems at play, maybe our property taxes and other things? Because if it's just the income tax, you can't beat Connecticut's rate.
Well, we know it's not the property tax because it's actually not that bad down in the areas that people would be interested in moving out of New York and staying employed in New York City. But here's the thing, at face value, it looks like tax rates are lower here in Connecticut, but people don't realize that we don't allow itemized deductions here. So if you add back an adjustment for that, we're somewhere between 9.6 and 10% on the income tax real world rate. So we're not as competitive as we think we are.
I would just add that I think anyone who can actually make a financial analysis of where they want to be has to also take into account the uncertainty that we have bred over the last decade. Right? You don't know from year to year to year what the actual tax code is going to look like, what the rate's going to be. So it's all fine and good to sort of pick up and come out of Westchester County or come out of Bergen County in New Jersey and sort of come into Fairfield, for example. That's fine. But if you feel like there's just such great uncertainty about what next year and the next year after that's going to look like, why are you going to take that gamble? So I've got to imagine that sort of factors in. We need to sort of figure out a way to start signaling not only to, yes, it's important to signal that to high net worth sort of folks who may want to move into the state, but more importantly, I think to business, that we have now committed to both a tax code and a set of rates, and we're not going to keep sort of jerking them from thing to thing to thing as we hit the next economic downturn.
Steve, can I ask you, a lot of people assume that businesses are only paying the corporation tax, and they don't realize that for a lot of businesses, the income tax is the primary tax, different types of pass-through corporations. Can you talk about how much businesses will actually pay attention to increases in the state income tax?
I think that people lose sight of the fact that when you look at, especially small businesses and new businesses, the statistic is somewhere around 90% of new business formation are all in the form of pass-through entities. And that is really what's going to drive the growth. And I'd like to defer to these two gentlemen because they hit the nail on the head. As Senator Frantz said, we tax based upon adjusted rate. I'm the accountant of the group, so I'm going to have a little bit of technical. I'm going to tell you the rates are, but we tax on adjusted gross income, right? There are no itemized deductions. So again, the devil's in the detail. You know, when you want to say, oh, let's look at our statutory rate, just like the sales tax example, line it up with the surrounding states. Sure, it looks great. It plays well in some chart that you stick in a magazine somewhere. But when you look and do the analysis, it becomes a much higher cost. And I think, as our comptroller says, then becomes the stability and the predictability. Because anyone who's looking to start a business, relocate a business, and they're thinking about coming to Connecticut, they recognize there's such volatility in the tax structure that when they're looking at making an investment decision 5 years out, 10 years out, that they're scared, right? They're going to hedge their bets. Yeah, the maximum right now in Connecticut is 6.7, but it wasn't that long ago. It was then, 4, 4.5, 5, 5.5. Where is it going? Well, if I'm going to do a trend analysis 10 years out, I got to tell you, it's only going in one direction. I think that's the biggest barrier, is the stability, the predictability, so people know the lay of the land.
Okay. Well, since you brought up volatility, Mr. Comptroller, you're on deck. I'm going to throw this to you first. Here's the trade-off. Connecticut gets a lot of money from Wall Street. About 40% of our income tax actually doesn't come from paycheck withholding. It comes from people who make payments quarterly, and the bulk of that involves capital gains, dividends, and interest. The problem is it's extremely, extremely volatile. And if the state has a history of planning and spending only when that revenue stream is rising, they don't plan for the fact that when we hit bad times, that the bottom falls out of that revenue stream, and then we're stuck contracting the budget really fast. Too many times the solution is, well, then let's just always plan for a worst case scenario. What can Connecticut do to kind of strike that balance, to recognize there'll be good times without counting on them too much, I guess?
We're going to call that an amazing setup, Keith.
That was the long-winded question.
I could see this like softball coming, and it was like, here it comes. And I'm going to actually hand it to Senator Frantz after I'm done, and that is, we have spent the day, most of the day, talking about just this issue, the tax volatility, the budget reserve fund, and how Connecticut could actually create a predictable and stable path into the future. And part of that is not in walking away from volatile revenue streams, not in always assuming that things are going to be bad, but rather in trying to figure out what's a reasonable growth rate over time in these very volatile tax categories. So our two most volatile tax categories are the corporate tax and the quarterly filer portion of the income tax that track with the financial markets are pretty consistently up and down. And I apologize in advance to people in the room who've heard me say this 3 times already today. But what we do historically is, as the market does this, and as the quarterly filers start to come in, the corporate tax comes in, we promise our way up to this new reality as if it's always going to remain that way. But we know, intellectually and emotionally, I think, that there's going to be a downturn, and you want to sort of make more investment, and you want to do the good things you've been waiting to do in good economic times. But at the same time, you can't overpromise, knowing that you're going to have to cut programs, cut services, and raise taxes as you're going down into the hole. And we've been on this sort of up and down for a long time. So Senator Frantz and his colleagues in the Finance Committee raised the bill today, had a public hearing, and we had an informational forum with Pew Charitable Trust, with our friends from Yankee Institute who are here in the room, and Connecticut Voices for Children. I'm just going to say that again. So Yankee Institute and Connecticut Voices for Children both agree on this particular proposal, and that is to sort of...
That's one of the signs of the apocalypse, technically.
Right. I just saw a white horse go running by, I don't know what it means. It really is about figuring out what the 10-year growth rates in those two categories are, and then putting a cap on what can be appropriated out of those, capturing revenue and stowing it away for the next economic downturn. It's very simple in concept. There's a little bit of an unfunded liability piece to it as well, but it would enable us to build reserves and good next time, which is inevitable with a volatile revenue stream, we'll have enough to sort of weather the storm. And the final thing I'll say about that is it does nothing to justify the amount of spending in the budget today. It doesn't sort of say it's too much, it doesn't say it's too little, and it is really meant to bring some sort of consistency and assurance to us and consumer confidence generally that drives a whole other portion of our tax categories, so that we can actually figure this out and be a little responsible, tie our hands in the short term so that we can live through the next downturn.
Senator Frantz, can you straighten the fiscal roller coaster before last call?
Yes, sure. When is last call? 9:30?
Yeah, you should get it done by then. Tons of time.
You know, I do want to say only you, the comptroller, can bring together two very different groups like that. In fact, they're thinking about merging, and they'd be called Voices for Yankees. Take it back. It's one of the most well thought out proposals that I've seen in my 7 years up there, and it's a wonderful concept in that it addresses the volatility problem that we have in the state of Connecticut, and it would do that on a very fair and objective basis if the bill is passed the way it's written today. As we all know, bills can change during the legislative process, and our job is to keep it exactly the way it is today. Not meaning that we wouldn't take any good ideas and put it in, I'm sure, but it seems as good as it could ever possibly be. I think it'll be a wonderful mechanism to keep things under control going into the future. We know we'll have more boom years, and we know for sure we'll also have some other years where we're in, as you say, in the hole.
If we could pass it down to Steve, I want to ask you, if it's okay with everyone, I want to shift gears for a minute to the sales tax. Earlier, you heard Senator Frantz say that we had something like 389 taxes on the books in Connecticut. This is a technical term, but we actually have 50 baskillion sales tax exemptions. That's a highly technical term you only hear at the Capitol. But we do have, all kidding aside, we have almost $4 billion worth of sales tax exemptions. If you didn't know it, winter yacht storage, you don't pay sales taxes on, but right now if you buy some clothing that costs $20, you do pay sales tax on it. Steve, you talked about consistency. How much of a problem is it for businesses, not just the fact that we tax more business inputs, whether it's different services or raw materials, and there's talk of putting sales tax on more business inputs going on at the Capitol now, but also just the fact that you never seem to know from year to year, depending on which lobbyists are more successful, what the sales tax will be levied on and what it won't.
Keith, I think that we see it in the sales tax, we see it in other areas as well, which is Connecticut has never had from the ground up a baseline that says this is our tax policy, and now let's move forward and make our decisions in line with the implications of that tax policy. Our tax policy has evolved to fill revenue shortfalls. Our tax policy has evolved to accommodate in certain times special interests. Our tax policy has evolved where we've had actually some very good working groups that developed some really good components that are part of tax policy. But holistically, it's all over the place. And I think that's the difficult thing. We see good aspects, we see bad aspects, but we don't see a policy and a theme that decisions are made around that baseline.
Can I ask both the other gentlemen to weigh in? Is there any chance at the Capitol of ever trying to bring some sanity to our sales tax, or is that just too big to expect in that arena?
I have to say, I was sort of hoping around the whole internet sales thing that it would engage us in a conversation about sort of flattening out, lowering the rate so we could take advantage of the compact, but now that seems to have taken care of itself on some level. I'm not sure if it actually did, but it feels like as companies have to put physical bricks and mortar presences here and agreed to pay sales tax, the pressure has come off that a little bit. But clearly, I mean, whether it's whatever exemptions we've got, whatever sales tax things are taxed on sales tax or not, it doesn't seem to follow any rational sort of thinking. And that's, as Steve points out, sort of an evolution of things over time. Who's got the better lobbyist? Who actually is able to advocate for a thing? But then you end up with this thing that really doesn't make a ton of sense. And whenever our public policy goals run contrary to our tax policy realities, you know you're going to have a problem because you're not going to achieve either as you move forward. But sales tax is a tough one. I don't know that the rate. I think the guy who figures out how to put it back at 6, no matter how they do it, sort of wins. And I don't know what they win, but they win another flight.
Sales tax would be excuse.
The thinking that is that doesn't really seem to sink in up at the Capitol is that there are two components to the equation of your tax revenues. Whether you're talking about the personal income tax, corporate income tax, or sales tax, it's not only the tax rate, but it's also the number of taxpayers. And so, in the case of the individual income tax, if you were to double the number of taxpayers by reducing the rate by 30% or 40%, mathematically you're ahead. The same thing holds true for the sales tax increase. By the way, I'm a pessimist if this is ever going to sink in the Capitol, but if you did lower it and substantially and applied it to everything and every activity and service, and maybe you could get it down to 2.5%, 3%. I don't know whether that's true or not, but that's what you need to be looking at to see if something like that could be achieved to make it more fair and to bring some, as you say, sanity to it.
Okay, hang on to that microphone, Senator. I'm coming right back to you. I want to talk corporation tax, and I'd like to talk winners and losers. There are some proposals at the Capitol right now, not only to maintain the surcharge on the corporation tax that was promised to go away as many times as I promised to keep the questions short, and in addition to put new limits on corporation tax credits, and as one person said, that's got to be a real disappointment for businesses unless you're UTC, and that was a remark in reference to about $400 million in tax credits UTC got last year. Excuse me, not tax credits, stranded tax credits that they were allowed to access. That's a fancy way of saying tax credits they were never going to get to use. Well, now they get to use them. Have we got to a point where we are literally just selecting winners and losers on a yearly basis, and is that eroding our business climate?
No, I think you characterized it very well, and I know we're going through a really tough fiscal time here. Again, it seems like as a certain person in Office of Policy Management stated publicly, we seem to be in a constant state of fiscal crisis here in Connecticut, and it's basically true. And so the budget that was generated by OPM has in it some really bad elements, such as curbing the value on the tax credits that were given as recently as 6 and 8 months ago in some cases. And for me, I'm a private sector guy. The legislature is my night job versus my day job. But when you do that, you're pulling the rug out from underneath a business partner. When the state negotiates, and they negotiate hard and meticulously for these different tax credits before they grant them to Starwood Enterprises or ESPN or whoever the case might be, and then to within 6 or 8 months ago renege on the full value of those credits. That doesn't say much about your trustworthiness going forward. So in the same way that you were saying, Steve, that you can't trust the state on tax rates 5 and 10 years down the road, can you trust as a business partner going down the road with these tax credits, which are the reason that many companies do come to the state of Connecticut, are going to be worth anything?
Steve, can I ask you the same question? I mean, when you hear on the one hand a bunch of tax relief proposals that you were counting on before the election are not going to happen, and at the same time you see certain select companies get significant relief, granted, very large employers. How does the business community as a whole look at that?
I think the business community's perspective, I think the senator was spot on in that, there are always going to be what we'll call, I split up, by the way, as credits and incentives. So let's just use those terms of art. Incentives are things that are negotiated. And I think that that's become part of the business dynamic, okay? But then there's the playing field, which are the credits. And the credits are statutorily provided by the legislature that say, if you engage in this investment activity in the state, right, if you conduct R&D in the state, if you make an investment in equipment in the state, you're going to get a credit that will help you offset your liability.
Excuse me, I'm going to jump in. You're going to get a credit that may help you because there are tons of credits. 50 bisquillion, I think is the right amount, that businesses are never going to get to use, and they're amassing more. We actually have billions, all kidding aside, of stranded credits.
So let me address that in a moment. So I think the thing with credits, what businesses are looking for in making investment decisions is that long-term stability. Because if you want to take the value of that statutorily provided credit and bake that into your investment decisions, you need to know that it's going to be there 3 years, 5 years, 10 years out. I think that's the piece that's the most frustrating in business relative to credits. When you talk about the gajillions of credits that are out there, just as when you speak about the gajillion of sales tax exemptions, those are certainly worthy of study, because I think that if you look at those that are seeking to make the business investment, be it the startup, be it businesses that have been here a long time, you could really narrow those down. And I think that what you find is a lot of those become misnomers, and frankly, a lot of them aren't used. And I think that would be the focus as we see that there's going to be the tax study panel that's going to be coming up. I think that that's something that's worthy to be looked at. Let's simplify it, but let's make it predictable and let's make it stable.
Well, let me just ask you, Kevin, because you've got a website that's trying to increase awareness, and we know that there are all types of exemptions or policies that don't get revisited for decades. I mean, do we really have, forget among the public, do we even among the General Assembly have the knowledge available to us to make really intelligent policy decisions all the time?
I think the short answer is no. Not that they're not intelligent, but 4 years ago I asked sort of what the ROI was on some of these tax credits, and sort of are we actually incentivizing economic activity, or are we subsidizing specific industry because it's been sort of put on the books and not examined for 20, 30 years? And the answer that came back was, I can't know. And so I figured, well, if I can't know, you can't know, and you probably can't know, you certainly can't know, Steve. So that's a problem, right? Because we need to be able to, or someone needs to be able to figure out, sort of, well, are we putting our dollars, our credits, our incentives in the right places? And on the incentive side, we've got pretty good transparency now. There's really sort of DCD is reporting out on sort of what the contracts require, what people got, where they are in their obligations. But on the whole tax credit thing, once it hits the tax return, it's protected under Connecticut law, and in a way that makes it a little hard to have external review and analysis of, are we doing the right thing? And there are incredible vested interests in place trying to sort of keep that sort of tucked down, because if you're a recipient of one of those, you don't want to give it up, right? And if you want one and you don't have the right lobbyist or the right advocate, you're not going to get it. So that's not a great dynamic. So I'm going to confess, I'm a Democrat, but I'm going to use the term winners and losers, right, which my Democratic colleagues sort of yell at me. I think our time, energy, resources are far better spent in creating consistency and an appropriate level of taxation and collection all across the board, but then building a business environment where companies who do a thing, and we sort of stay out of their way, right, so that we build fertile ground for that company to exist and to grow and to hire more people, instead of saying 333, the magic number is 3. If you hire 3 employees, we'll give you a gift, and life is good. That's fine in a down economic time where you're trying to sort of keep things going. But as things start to pick up, I think businesses win and lose based on the quality of the business model, but also we've got to be doing our part. So I am generally against subsidizing pizza joints, bagel joints, places where, not breweries we love, but places where the economy and economic theory sort of plays out in a real way. You got lousy pizza and you're charging too much, you go out of business, and frankly, you deserve to. We don't need any more bad pizza. But if you've got a good idea and you're working hard, our job is to make sure you can move your people, move your product, have a business regulation climate that makes sense, and move information. And I'm talking about broadband and fiber optics and making sure our data-heavy industries that like Connecticut, because PhDs per capita and all this stuff that we got going for us, that they can do their work, and we're not sort of trying to make believe we really understand what their business model is, because we don't. We're bad. If I was good at that, if the state was good at that, would go work somewhere else, picking winners and losers in the market and making real money.
Okay, we got probably about 10 more minutes. I'm going to try to squeeze in 2 more questions, then we'll turn it over to the audience. So start thinking about what you want to ask. I want to ask one torturous question on property taxes. Everyone would say, let's lower property taxes. I'd much rather reduce state spending and give towns more aid. But I'm taking that answer off the table. I want to know, with property taxes so high, with the new numbers from CCM showing that even with municipal aid being kept flat for the last 4 years, property taxes still have grown over the last term by double digits. The comptroller had cited the state's tax incidence report. It shows households that make less than $48,000 a year, they're paying almost 24% of all their earnings for state and local taxes. It very quickly after that drops off to single digits, which shows you they're getting clobbered with property taxes passed on through the rent. So here's the torturous question. Is it worthwhile to increase some tax at the state level and put all of the proceeds into reducing property taxes? Whoever wants to handle that horrible question first can have it, but I want to hear all 3.
So, yeah, that's one of the biggest issues, I think, that the state faces is the issue of property taxes, especially larger municipalities. Some ideas, as you know, Keith, have been floated at the Capitol, one being the car tax, which, can I go into it? You want me to?
I specifically want to know, would it be worthwhile to raise one state tax and pour that money into municipal aid to try to lower property taxes, or is that not worthwhile? And if so, what tax would you raise?
Okay, so the car tax is the one that comes closest to what I think you're describing here. There's some other schemes that are being talked about, some that are actually in bill language at this point. I don't know if they're going to go anywhere, but the idea is to create a statewide tax for automobiles. And so your money, instead of going to Wolcott or Waterbury, would go to the city of Hartford, and it would be distributed formulaically throughout the state.
That was close, but that was not quite it. I'm sorry. It was a torturous question. You replaced the local property tax with a state property tax. So I'm saying, would you want to, for example, increase the income tax, take the money and give it to towns and say, use this to lower your property taxes? Or is that not worthwhile? I'm talking about a tax shift.
So
is that a smart thing to do?
You're saying go to a different source of revenue to the state?
I disqualified your first answer, yes.
Okay. Yes.
I'm glad I didn't answer it first. That's all I know.
The answer is that could be a real slippery slope. And I wouldn't recommend it at all, because what you need to do at the end of the day is you need to encourage very good management of municipalities, towns, and there are some exceptionally well-run towns in the state of Connecticut, and there are some that are not as well-run. And you can see it in their fiscal numbers at the end of every quarter, at the end of every fiscal year. And once you started to find an alternate source of new revenue to start to balance out the property tax situation, then I think you're letting the genie out of the bottle. It would never get back in, and I think it would be very damaging to the state of Connecticut. In the same way that this proposed car tax, which may actually get some traction this year, could also be, there are going to be winners and there are going to be losers, like the hospital tax. There are winners and there's definite losers.
Okay, Mr. Comptroller, poor people are paying 24% of their earnings and taxes. You're going to leave them hanging there?
I think I'm going to disagree with the senator a little bit, that we agree on most things. I think, look, I moved to Connecticut, I don't know, 20 years ago, whatever it was, and I've got 2 older kids on the autism spectrum. I'm sorry to use up time on this story, but I think it's illustrative. So they're on the autism spectrum, and so the first thing I did, being a guy with advanced degrees, is sort of figure out which towns in Connecticut do this thing well, right? Because I want my kids to get the best thing they can. And then we drove up 95 on a Sunday and stopped off at towns all along the way, and then stopped in Guilford, which is where I live, and said, okay, the town feels right, it looks like Murder, She Wrote, and they do autism services, right? This is the place, right? So, you know, fine. That's fine for me. That works. But I think when I look at municipal spending, and I look at the burden of special education on education budgets, and I look at the regressive nature of some of the sort of the aspects of the property tax, and I look at the situation that you create when a kid in maybe New Haven is landlocked and economically locked in a school system that may ensure that their only path out of the same diagnosis that my kids got is probably Social Security disability and probably Section 8 and some sort of assistance, where our kids, because they got what they needed and are similarly situated to those other kids, now are both working full-time and paying taxes, right? So we're going to potentially create, if we keep going the way we're going, and specifically around special ed, and we have some communities developing expertise and others not. And what's the incentive for a town to do it well if you know that a whole bunch of new people are going to come and drive up our education budget? This is a problem, sort of long term. This is an example of where 169 towns plus doing it a different way, some better and some worse, is going to lead to bad outcomes. So if this is the primary driver in municipal spending, which I think it is right now, second to education, second to healthcare, but you know, we need to figure that piece out. And maybe it is a statewide solution. And I'm not necessarily advocating at this point for an income tax-based financing of this regionalized, education plan, but we got to do something, and it can't be on the burden of the local property taxpayer to figure it out. And maybe we don't.
So that's a maybe.
Qualified maybe.
Okay. Steve, you going to raise some state taxes to increase municipal aid?
I would like to say I'm glad I'm answering this last. It's given me a little bit of time to think, and I can, steal from the other answers. So Keith, what you're teeing up is premised on 2 things.
Sure.
One, that the state can do it more efficiently, and that this money will never find its way into the general fund. That if forever and a day, it'll stay earmarked for cities and towns.
Are you implying that's ever happened before?
Do you have any proof? In the famous words of Ollie North, I can neither confirm nor deny movement to the general fund. I guess, representing the business community, I would say it this way. I would say that we have a very high property tax burden in this state, second in the country, second to New Jersey when you look at it on a per capita basis. What we, from a business community perspective, would want that tax paid to a place that is efficient and effective with that use of money. So I'll go to what the comptroller said. If what we are looking for, by way of example, because there's many services the town provides, but obviously education, large budget item, right? My public school teacher, home with the kids now, but public school teacher nonetheless, some years ago. If special education could be delivered with better quality, better efficiency, at a lower cost, that's where the revenue should go. If that money could go to the state and be earmarked and delivered, then we'd be behind it. If it's better served on a regional basis, a local basis, it's just like you run a business. You want it to be efficient, you want to deliver services, and you want those services to be top-notch.
Oh, I think that's fair. The reason I hang on to that, Steve, the reason I put everyone through that is
I'm in trouble now.
It's generally easier to talk about how we're going to spend the money. You don't hear a lot of people clamoring at the Capitol for inefficient spending. That party didn't do well in the last election. But at some point, somebody has to raise the revenue. At some point. So sometimes it's really tough to have that discussion. Last thing, because I do want to get to the audience, but I'd like to just, even if we get a lightning round answer from everyone, any thoughts, whenever the state gets to the point where it's going to make a big transportation investment, what's the best way to raise new transportation revenues? Just real quick thought from everyone.
Loaded question. I guess what we would want to make sure is that we keep commerce flowing so that we don't...
Steve, you cannot answer by saying you want it to be a more prosperous Connecticut. We won't have to raise revenue from anyone. I'm looking for tolls, gas, taxes, fees on fishermen. Do you have any ideas for how we would actually raise the revenue?
We already have one of the highest gas taxes in the country. We already have very high burdens and bases to begin with. I think Connecticut, when you look at our broad policy, we have pushed the envelope on virtually every tax type. And that is making it difficult for me to have the silver bullet to say, yes, this is the gap we should go to. Because if that existed today, Keith, you know and I know that the legislature would have found that would have been the untapped revenue, and that's how we would have closed the budget gap. It's just a very difficult answer.
Mr. Comptroller, are you going to take a big El Paso, or are you going to try?
No, have you nobody to take a pass on anything? I'll just say that, look, we don't only have the people who drive on a specific segment of a road pay for that road as a general matter. There's a toll conversation, and I'm going to set that aside for a second. So I live on Long Hill Road. Just because I don't drive on 77 doesn't mean I shouldn't pay for 77. If I ever drive on 95, it's part of the infrastructure of the state. So I think you need to fund transportation no matter what it is, including the information superhighway, and I'm going to keep saying it, with the broadest base tax that you have available to you,
which is
probably the income tax.
There I said. You know, I think it's important to have a realistic transportation plan going down the road. The one that's called for now, which everybody's focused on, is a $100 billion plan, which will be implemented over 25 years, not 30, but it's 25 years.
I won't ask you to fund that one. Don't worry.
Myself?
No.
You know, and if you talk to folks at DOT, they'll tell you there's no way that they can do $4 billion worth of work every year. You'd have to shut down 95 and 91 and maybe others to be able to accomplish that, and that we simply can't afford to do. So the answer to your question, which is where does the funding come from?
What would be the best funding for you if a transportation initiative that you felt good about, whatever the dollar amount is, if you felt you had to raise revenue to fund it, what would be the source or sources?
You know what I would do is, there's a tremendous amount of bonding capacity.
Okay, this is a form of the El Paso. This is another form of efficiency.
No, you see, because revenues are the same thing as bond proceeds in the state of Connecticut. You knew that, right?
I did know that, but I also know that
it's a new era. It's a new era.
He's trying to trick me to talk about bond premiums, which is I'm not going to do that.
Do you want to hear about bond premiums?
Okay.
Because they're financing the state going forward.
I appreciate that. I'll take that as, okay, there's not a preferred revenue-raising source for you for transportation. You would rather the state reassign its priorities.
Yes. If you do it that way, you don't need new revenues. I'm not a fan of tolls, as most people know.
Yeah, see, my job's not looking as fun now, is it? Okay. I think we should just do it informal. If somebody wants to, raise their hand or stand up with a question, we'll just try to go. We'll start here. I'll go right next to you, sir.
Alan Brewster. I live in Milford. I've lived in a number of different states, and one of the things I see about the efficiency issue. Sorry, my name's Alan Brewster. I live in Milford. I've lived in a number of different states, and one of the things I see about the efficiency issue with regard to the town spending, I think that the property taxes are a real problem because of the regressive nature of them throughout the state. But I've lived in Maryland, and basically they provided most of their services at a county level, not the local level. And I know this is a sacred cow in Connecticut, but it seems to me that we have too many towns trying to do their own little thing by themselves, and they're never going to be very efficient at it, even if they try hard. So it seems to me that one of the issues we have to deal with in terms of the property tax is how efficient can 169 towns be in Connecticut.
I'll give the microphone to anyone who wants to talk about regional spending. If you also enter, should we have regional taxation to go with it?
Grab a hold. Exactly. The best answer will come from right out there in the audience. So a lot of thinking has been put into the whole idea of regionalization without doing county government, because you're right, that is a sacred cow. I think people would be generally against that if there was an initiative to go that direction. And yes, there's a lot to be said about doing things collectively, especially if you're in the northwestern part of Connecticut, or even if you're down in this part. You have some towns where there could be synergy if they got together and bought snow plows or did a dog pound together. How many dog pounds do you need? Everybody wants their own dog pound for some reason. So yeah, and we're going that direction with the new Council of Governments. It's all been reorganized, and there are different members nowadays. And there may be some good that come from those new COGS, Council of Governments, COGS, with respect to some synergies and efficiencies in going forward, particularly on capital intensive programs, like the maintenance trucks or snow plows or things like that. And I have to believe there's definitely some opportunities in the area of first responders as well, both fire and police.
This happens very rarely.
It's the third rail of Connecticut politics. You grab a hold of it and you're done. So I'm going to say it out loud. You grab a hold of that third rail and you're finished, because everybody likes their own thing. We all like the concept of regionalization until we actually see it play out and what it's going to mean for us. And it's fine if you live in a community where you think you've got a Chinese wall sort of around your community, but none of us do. So a community next door that's struggling, it's sort of there's impact up and down and throughout a region. One of the things that's been most disappointing to me is that one of my goals in coming into this office was, I'm going to look for ways to do what we do better, and I'm going to look for ways to leverage what the state does to make opportunities available for municipalities to drive down their burden by coming together to buy things like healthcare. And so we put the partnership plan in place, and we offered a benefit to municipalities, and a number of them came in, and they got prices for what it would cost them to buy into this plan, where they would share risk at some level. And even when the benefit was better and the price was lower, towns still walked. They didn't want to participate. Now, I resisted my urge to out the first selectman and the Board of Finance, in that town, because I don't think we'll actually get where we want to go if I do that. It's a one shot. But we really need to sort of figure out what our expectations as a state are versus the municipalities, and what the municipalities' role is going to be in trying to find their own efficiencies. So I get that you don't trust the state government and you don't want to come into coalition with us for various reasons. I get that. But at the end of the day, if it's costing your property taxpayers way more than it should to do your healthcare the way you're doing it, you're going to have to answer to the folks on the ground in that community to explain why you decided that you weren't going to do that. And it can't just be ideological, and if it's ideological, then that's a problem. That's a problem.
He's good.
Sorry, you had a thought you wanted to share?
Brett, after that, there was a gentleman in the back.
So then we'll hop in this one. They had something off the center.
Hi, John Dibble, Morgan Stanley. First of all, I want to previous it by thank you all so much for coming out and taking the time out of your day to share this panel with us. I think I speak about everyone and say I appreciate it. Shifting gears just a little bit, and I don't mean to beat a dead horse here, but talk about our state's unfunded pension liabilities. We have Malloy who've been reelected. Where do we stand on it? What's the course taken to address them? And specifically, if we could get into it, what are at least the ideas on the table for the money coming from to bring this down? In other words, obviously kicking the can is not going to work forever. Unfortunately, I wish our federal government could learn from that. But at least on the state level, what are we planning to do about that?
Wow, okay. Want to go with that?
Who's going to hit it?
So a couple of things. One is, two things. One is the state employee or retiree benefit, that's one piece. I'm going to use the example of 2013 where the ARC payment, so the minimum payment that the state had to make for the pension fund in that year was $1.26 billion, roughly. $250 million of that was what we call the normal cost of the pension fund. So the transactional cost of paying our retirees their benefit. The 1 whatever billion that remains was to pay off the unfunded liability for that year. The unfunded liability exists because policymakers over a 20-year period shorted the minimum payment necessary to fund the pension fund and walked around with that extra cash and did other things with it, and none of us really knew it was happening because they didn't ask our opinion about it. And now you've got, I wish I had my slides with me, but you've got this thing that looks like this. You've got the normal cost of the pension fund that's sort of like this and actually shrinking with Tier 2, 2A, Tier 3 over time. I'm not arguing for the benefit design, so don't hear that. We can talk about that. The rest of it, like this, is the unfunded liability. We're on a 17-year amortization schedule to pay off the unfunded liability. The pension payment will be, this year will be something like 1.4, 1.5, does that sound about right? Same breakout, mostly unfunded liability payment, the rest of it's normal cost. And at the end of 17 years, you'll be left with something like a $500 million annual payment as long as you don't make the same stupid decisions that got us into this position in the first place. Now, nobody wants to hear that we're going to blame the people before us, but for context, it's important to know that. So two, the proposal that's coming out of the Finance Committee has a third element to it, and that is to grab a little bit, like a nickel on a dollar to begin, then 10 cents, then 15 cents on that excess revenue that I talked about earlier, and throw it against the unfunded liability in an effort to shrink that amortization period and also squash the ARC payment in the next year, which creates additional room in the budget. But that's like Yankee thrift. It's like land of steady habit stuff. It's like, you just got to commit to do it and then do it and realize there's going to be no ribbon to cut. Nobody's going to get you a balloon because you did the right thing. You just got to continue to do the right thing. The third thing, or fourth or fifth, whatever thing it is that I'm going to say now, is that there has been an OPEB trust, because the other piece about all this is the cost of retiree health benefits throughout time. We have to report that now, which we didn't before. And there's an OPEB trust that's been put in place. Employees are paying into the OPEB trust. That, together with the changes we've made to the health plan, have actually shrunken the cost of OPEB and the out-year expectations, because we're actually wrangling costs now, and our folks are healthier. Now, it's going to blow the actuarial tables on the pension fund, but because people will live longer. But that's a whole separate happy problem.
I think the comptroller puts it well. I mean, this is something that's gone on for years. And I think what it points out is the fundamental structural problem of looking at things on a short-term basis versus a long-term basis. And the reality for the legislature is they look to get reelected, right? That's their job. It's a short window, right? And they're willing to do this on a part-time basis. And you have a lot of people that are trying to do the right thing. But at the end of the day, budgets need to get balanced, and so lo and behold, as you use the term, it just kind of kicks the can. I think that's also true relative to tax policy. We have seen so many things evolve trying to plug revenue gaps or things popping up here, and it really kind of begs the question of when is enough enough, and let's stop and let's develop what that baseline is, and let's continue to make our decisions relative to a well thought out policy that's going to kind of dictate when we need revenue, do we choose option A or do we choose option B? Because you recognize every decision you make is going to have a consequence. And it's time that you look to make decisions not in a haphazard basis. Oh, well, OFA says this is worth $30 million. Let's go to the shelf and let's get the $30 million shelf. And there another time it's the $20 million shelf. You need to make decisions that are strategic and that they last for the long term, because then you build a house on a solid foundation, and it's going to weather the tough times because you've built that solid foundation.
Just real quick, I think it's also worthy of considering how we make changes to tax policy, and I think a cooling off period sort of makes sense. I think we make decisions in crisis, as Steve has pointed out. We go to the shelf, we buy those little finger handcuffs because they're 5 points. and then we realize that we can't get out of them. I think when someone proposes we need to raise a tax to get a thing, we probably should say, absent a supermajority vote of the legislature to move this thing forward because we're really in an emergency, we're going to send it out for analysis, we're going to figure out what the downstream impact is, and then bring it back and make an informed decision. And when you bring it back, then maybe the crisis has passed, and maybe it's still the right thing to do, and then you can go ahead and do it.
I'm really glad you asked the question because it's something that I lose a lot of sleep about. And our unfunded liabilities in total, depending on what source you go to, is anywhere between $65 and $85 billion. We're 3.6 million people in the state of Connecticut, so on a per capita basis, we're amongst the worst in the country if you add that number to the current tax liability that we as taxpayers face on an annual basis. So we're heavily burdened. We have a real tough time balancing a budget in the first place, no matter how good times are or how bad times are. It's just a very difficult thing for this legislative body to do with the blessing of the administration. And given that, we have to start doing exactly what the comptroller said before that we should do. But it's a pretty tall order because when you think about it, people aren't living to be 85 to 90 years old, and by the time we get to be a little older, they'll be living to be 100 years old. If you're a retired professor after putting in 20 years at UConn, and your pension payment is $292,000 a year, that's the end of the bell curve, but it is true. It's the end of the bell curve. The middle is more like, I don't know what the number is, but
My pension will be $36,000.
36.
Do another 100 years of state service.
there you go.
Proof I'm not going to do.
Proof that's all.
Here you can drink. Godspeed.
Yeah, proof that the harder you work, the less you get rewarded in state government anyway. But so you have all these different conditions, and it's going to get worse. And the hill that the comptroller was talking about, climbing to get back to where we would be considered to be in a normal fiscal position with respect to pensions, specifically, is going to be that much steeper. So you asked a very good question tonight.
We have time for one more?
Sure.
One more question. Two?
Education funding when you touched on special education. And there's a lot of people who have observed that both the way we fund public schools and the property tax system are fundamentally broken. And I think you could also argue that they're two sides of the same coin, right? Because most of the property tax dollars go to funding public education. I'm wondering if all of you think or have some recommendations about how the two systems could be fixed simultaneously in order to solve both problems.
Just think holistic, think big things. Might involve revenue, I'm just warning you now.
I think it's a trick.
What you're seeing now is people are going through the notes in their head going, is there any way we can find some savings somewhere so I don't have to say probably the only way to fix that would be to shift huge costs off the cities and towns and onto the state. Did that get anyone's juices flowing?
I mean, is that the only way to do it? Is the only way to do it to shift the cost off some cities and towns onto the state? And do you...
Well, if you want, I'll say this since I'm announcing my candidacy now. But, thank you. In other states, like New Jersey, where a judge actually ordered it, if your goal is to truly equalize education, you have to have some degree of uniformity, and you just have such variation of wealth in Connecticut that if you want to do that, the first step, and there's definitely an inefficiency factor here, I'm not saying this is a panacea, is generally in the states that have done this, what happens is they eliminate this cost at the local level. Property taxes go way down. Usually it's state income tax, that's the main revenue engine, and then you have to deal with the whole challenge of the state bureaucracy. If somebody knows another way it's been done, please tell me.
So in some states, they've shifted from essentially a local property tax.
In some states, they've shifted from a local property tax toward a state property tax. Vermont essentially did something like that, rather than shifting from a local property tax to a state income tax, which then leads to volatility. Do you think there's any appetite in Connecticut from shifting some property taxation from the municipal level to the state level?
I'll hand this one over. You're seeing them inch toward it as much as these gentlemen are inching toward the microphone. They are taking small steps at the Capitol, but I think it goes back to what the comptroller said. It's just, I hate to use cliches like the quotes like the land of steady habits, but you don't see a willingness to take those types of risky steps on either side of the aisle. Does anyone? No, I can't pass this.
Interesting that you brought up the case of Vermont. They did do that up there called Act 60. It sounds like you know a little something about that law. And what happened up there, it's a great example of why you should not do this, and I would be against this at the state level here in Connecticut. They increased taxes on out-of-state homeowners, vacation homeowners. They started out with 6 what they call gold towns, and they only increased the taxes there. So taxes went up about 250%, 300% for the out-of-staters. There's a concept called taxation without, what is it, Keith? Taxation without enough votes, yeah, without representation. So, and who's going to, go up and gather Montpelier to go fight, this kind of a thing? It's not going to happen. They know that. They put Act 60 into place. Now there are 14 gold towns. Taxes have gone up as much as 900% for those out-of-towners, and the real estate market is dead in the water. Dead in the water. They are shooting themselves in the foot, at the end of the day. And incidentally, the budgets have gone through the roof. The administration numbers have grown by 30%. Student population has gone down by 15%, and the results, test results are not good.
Yeah, we're going to get to one more question.
Oh, let's go.
You can stick around a little bit afterward, right, to answer any follow-ups. Thank you very much. Here you go, sir.
Yeah, Charles Rees, Madison, Connecticut. I've spent most of my career in high tech, and I think there's another glaring difference between taxation in this state and other states. Most states, for small business, there's a large incentive, truly an incentive, to invest in R&D and to give advanced training to employees. Why? It seems like it's another third rail when we talk about income tax. But why is it so difficult to incent pass-through organizations to invest in R&D?
Steve, you want to take a crack at that?
You point out an issue that the credits predominantly, let's just speak to the R&D credits, right? There's predominantly 2 of the larger R&D credits in Connecticut, the incremental and non-incremental. Those are only available to subchapter C corporations. And I think when you look at the genesis of how that evolved is predominantly those that were doing that type of investment over the years were your largest C corporations. When you look at it, what I had mentioned earlier is that when you look at startups today, right, about 90% of businesses being formed are in the form of pass-through entities, right? It's individuals getting investors, etc. It creates a paradigm shift for Connecticut because the Connecticut legislature historically has not wanted to have credits applied to the personal income tax. That's been kind of one of those things that it's the sacred cow. We don't want, we want to keep it simple. Let's tax AGI, let's do it at this percent. But again, this ever increasing percent, it's now up to 6.7. I believe it started at 4 back in 91 when the tax was enacted. It's something that really needs to be looked at from a policy perspective because if you want to generate growth, if you want Connecticut to be innovative, and you are outside the realm of the publicly traded company, right, that's typically going to be your subchapter C Corp, how do you get those people motivated? And that's one of the things that can come into play. One of the things I'll also say is that recently I was up in Cambridge, Mass, and it is amazing to see the hotbed of activity. You have everything from large publicly traded companies to startups all over the place. You can't find space there. You can't find parking there. They've created an environment like that, and I think that's the direction we'd like to see Connecticut. It's good for everyone, right? That's going to bring talent here that we can hire. We'll have the best workforce. We'll be bringing ingenuity to the state. We'll be bringing that inventive. That's what made this state great. We need to create that cycle again. And I guess the last thing I would add, probably the exception here, I know the comptroller's been here 20 years. I was born and raised in Hartford. My father and mother, born and raised in Hartford, lived here our whole lives. We really want to see Connecticut succeed. And maybe we are at that tipping point now, because when you go back to 2008, right, we've seen the recovery, we've seen surrounding states recover. We haven't felt that. We need to make the right decisions to make this the right state for businesses to grow and develop, whether startups or your publicly traded companies. We need to create that environment, because every business that's opening in another state, we're losing that opportunity here in Connecticut.
I want to say ditto, but I'll probably get in trouble. There is no reason whatsoever that these credits can't be available to passive farmers. There's just no reason, except the internal dynamics around the folks who are getting them now, thinking there may be something less for them if that sort of gets expanded in that way. But Steve, I think, and you are on point, and that is, this is the segment of the market. This is the piece of industry. These are the folks that are scraggly-headed, sort of master's prepared, smart kids coming out of UConn and Yale and Wesleyan, and they've got big ideas that are going to save our financial life. But if we don't put things in place that sort of incentivize them to stay and to grow and to invest and do all of those things, then we're going to continue to lose them to Cambridge. When Pfizer sort of left out of Groton and headed back up to Cambridge, and they called all the constitutionals and they said, well, we just want to let you know we're going to announce this later on today. I asked, well, what could we have done differently? And the guy was really nice. He said, well, nothing now. But if 10 years ago you had figured out that the synergy of the medical center and the research facility and the small bit and all that needs to be there, and you need to incentivize the whole thing, everybody wins, but it's never too late. So we hope that you'll try again. And I think we have taken some steps, but there's a ton more that needs to be done, and it's a tough battle at the Capitol.
Yeah, it's really, at the end of the day, I think it's all about getting critical mass going, and Connecticut has a bit of a disadvantage there. 140 years ago, had an incredible advantage there in places like Hartford and Waterbury and Wolcott, I have to believe too, because it was a different kind of industry at that point that dominated those different regions or the state itself. Nowadays, it's high tech, it's financial services, and you don't have that kind of critical mass other than in places like Stamford, Connecticut, a little bit in Hartford, and I think that's really about it. So again, just as a general comment, the best economic development policy a state can have is to make your business environment friendly, keep your taxes as low as they can possibly go, make it fun and exciting for younger people to start businesses there, stick around after they've been educated in the state of Connecticut, for example, and get critical mass going, then you stand up and fight a chance. Thank you.
I want to thank our panel wildcard, Steve LaRosa down at the end, for bringing some energy back into this room. Thank you, Steve, for coming. Our transportation wildcard panelist is in the back, Michael Riley, if he wants to see his show. On Tuesday, 2 roads, second leg of the policy pairing series. All kidding aside, Stephen LaRosa, State Comptroller Kevin Lembo, and Senator Scott Frantz, thank you for joining us today. Today is a sad day because I heard Keith announce his candidacy. So he no longer works at the Mirror, but if you want to check out some of his past work, ctmirror.org. I want to thank our sponsor, CT 20x17 campaign. Fantastic support behind it, and of course some people who support the Mirror through non-taxable donation in this room. Thanks for supporting non-profit journalism at its best in the state. Thanks. Stick around. They're open till 9. So are we. Thank you.